ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2019 UNESCO Chair Oration. We have invited, indeed, a Wurundjeri elder, Auntie Dai, to offer and perform Welcome to Country. Unfortunately, she's unwell and couldn't make it. So I commence proceedings by acknowledging that we are meeting tonight. Indeed, all of us live and work on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay our respects to their elders and leaders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge any Indigenous people attending with us tonight. This is a very relevant and timely event indeed in terms of the Indigenous theme. There are many dignitaries and VIPs to acknowledge all of you here, but I would like to acknowledge, of course, our Vice Chancellor, Professor Ian Martin, who is the host for this UNESCO Chair, and of course our distinguished Professor Marcia Langton, who will be the orator in a few minutes. Yes, thank you. There are, of course, many guests and colleagues and friends and supporters of Deakin, of the UNESCO Chair and the Institute. And I can see many colleagues from senior management also at Deakin who have made time to be with us tonight. I will start by offering some reflections on the UNESCO Chair and contextualizing a little bit this oration. Then Professor Ian Martin will come in and he will welcome you formally and also introduce our orator in a few minutes. I think in terms of having a prominent Indigenous leader and a distinguished scholar deliver the 7th UNESCO oration for us tonight is indeed very timely. I was telling Professor Langton earlier, when I went to meet with her about a couple of months ago, I think, in your office in Melbourne Uni, and we were talking about tonight. Of course, at that time, she was still, hasn't been nominated as the co-leader of the senior advisory group that will undertake the consultation process towards establishing your voice to government. And I think since then, obviously, your load has been made even more busy. There are, of course, have been many recent events, from the Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017 to the announcement of this process to work on delivering a voice to government. Our orator will no doubt discuss in more depth and in more details some of these particular issues in her capacity, of course, as co-chair with Professor Tom Kalma of the Senior Advisory Group, a two-part and stages process in the co-design process that will unfold over the next couple of years. And I will leave that to Professor Langton later on to talk a little bit more about that. I would like to briefly shift attention from this important announcement of talking about the voice to government and offer some brief reflections too from a UNESCO point of view, because UNESCO also is absolutely committed to the justice struggle of Indigenous communities all over the world, including in Australia, of course. And I would like to talk a little bit about what can be done outside of government. Of course, government is very important. That's where things happen. But there are things that can be done outside of government to advance reconciliation, from different perspectives indeed. Let's bear in mind that Reconciliation Australia, for instance, identifies 5 key dimensions of reconciliation. And let's reflect on them. Race relations, equity and equality, institutional integrity, historical acceptance, and unity. And you can see the interconnected nature of these 5 dimensions of reconciliations. They are intrinsically connected. But also, for us here, in particular those who come from the tertiary education sector, speaking from that particular perspective, there is so much that we can do. And I am very pleased and proud that at Deakin we've started and we've been doing things in this process. Just to mention a few examples, that we do host the Institute of Koori Education. We have a research chair in Indigenous Knowledges who's actually with us here, Professor in Paradise. And more recently at Deakin, we also have appointed the new Provost Chancellor Indigenous to lead our work in this space. More specifically, too, within the Alpha Deakin Institute, which I have the honor and pride to lead, we have a growing Indigenous research focus within one of our 4 core research programs, which is Heritage and Indigeneity, with a growing number of researchers continuing to work with various Indigenous communities, leaders and scholars, really generally speaking, in order to advance the rightful claims of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders peoples around recognition, empowerment and justice. It is this spirit in particular that we are, for this particular reason also, that we are honoured to host this evening Professor Langton to deliver this timely and important oration. And for those of you who have been perhaps attending, this is what for us, the UNESCO chair team, this is a highlight for the year. That brings me back to the actual chair. What does the chair do and what is it? So the chair was established in 2013. It is specifically dedicated and focused on trying to understand some of the ethical dilemmas that we face as modern societies, as pluralistic societies, in terms of living and coping and dealing with the notion of difference. And has a strong emphasis on particular regions and demographic cohorts, so youth in particular, but also working with the Global South is absolutely essential to the UNESCO mandate. I will not say more about the UNESCO chair because we have a short video, actually, rather than me speaking to you, there's a short video which will summarize what the chair has been able to acknowledge more friends, what the chair has been busy doing over the last 6 years. So the team here, in particular Giants, has been very busy preparing this brief report. When this short video finishes, Professor Ian Martin will come to the microphone and he will officially welcome you and also introduce the keynote speaker. The chair, during the first 4 years of its inception, was tasked mainly with developing a research program which is aligned with the UNESCO priority areas. The priority areas for UNESCO are essentially to conduct research and disseminate that research in areas of poverty eradication, good governance, leadership training, dealing with youth problems, in particular in the Global South. The chair in its first term was really working on developing the foundations for a genuinely collaborative program. UNESCO obviously emphasizes teaching and education, and one of the key goals of UNESCO is actually education for all, quality education for all, irrespective of where they come from. And we see that training good researchers as a fundamental part of sustaining knowledge production processes, and in particular in areas where there are some problems in relation to knowledge and existing gaps. UNESCO in particular, perhaps more than any other agency in the UN, sees a strong mandate to be really on building capacity in the Global South, but also a capacity in relation to building the scientific and the educational capacity of the Global South. There is a big problem within the global knowledge production, which is an imbalance between what the North produces and what the Global South produces. And UNESCO sees part of its mandate is to try to narrow and bridge that gap. So working with colleagues in the Global South, working with civil society organizations in Global South, working with youth from the Global South is a fundamental part of what UNESCO does. We had a number of successful projects undertaking since the establishment of the chair in 2013. Most recently in 2017, for instance, a book that was developed as part of the UNESCO Unitwin network, and that book was on the new concept of intercultural dialogue or interculturalism at the crossroads, looking at issues of policy, issues of theory and issues of practice. Other work produced on global migration, in particular with an emphasis on women, and a number of other papers and special issues of journals which looked into diaspora communities, migrant communities, issues of racism, and issues of social marginalization of youth. A lot of that research is part and parcel of what the chair does. So having the UNESCO Orations as an annual event involving high-profile public speakers who advocate for some of these issues, I think is very, very important because it reaches out to a different audience, it communicates some of the messages in a much more accessible manner, and also it highlights the plight of a number of individuals and communities in our societies which otherwise would not have a voice.
So for instance, in inviting Nobel Peace Prize Rigobert Menschel to deliver the oration in 2015 was really highlighting the struggle of the indigenous communities of South America and the indigenous communities globally, and what it takes for those struggles to actually achieve outcomes for those communities. The next 4 years are going to be extremely busy for the chair. We have already started a number of very exciting projects, none more so perhaps than trying to develop the first ever global index on intercultural dialogue. So this hasn't happened before. We're trying to look at how different societies are tracking in relation to social peace using the instrument of intercultural dialogue, and a number of other projects, in particular around multicultural education and how different jurisdictions approach multicultural education in terms of resourcing professional training and in terms of how that plays out in reality in schools.
Thank you very much indeed, Fethi. It's my privilege to be Deacon's Vice-Chancellor, and in gathering here tonight, I too wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered, but perhaps in the context of tonight to reflect that those traditional owners' feet have trod on this land for more than 3,000 generations, and there is a whole sense of history and culture and knowledge that has gone before and will go forward from here. And I think that is the context we're talking about tonight, is that very, very rich history that is really important. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Marcia Langton here this evening. Thank you again to Professor Fethi Mansouri, who's the Director of the Alfred Deakin Institute. Members of our University Council and executive here, lots of Deakin staff, and many, many friends and guests, and it really is on behalf of the entire University a great pleasure to welcome you here today. This year's oration, entitled Empowering Indigenous Australians, is both timely and important. As someone who was not born in this country, and indeed was born in a country where the concept of indigeneity was something that was almost completely alien, I feel somewhat unqualified to be introducing Marcia tonight. And indeed somebody from a country whose perhaps many of the challenges we now face is sort of responsible for. But over the last 20 years, which I've spent in the main in New Zealand and Australia, I've gathered a real sense of the importance of understanding that very rich and deep history, and the importance of acknowledging that there is more to history than the history that many of us were taught in school. My time in New Zealand absolutely gave me an understanding of that, and it gave me an understanding of why the Welcome Country would not be delivered in English, it would be delivered in Te Reo Māori, reflecting the fact that there was a treaty underpinning a relationship, albeit not a perfect treaty, albeit not a treaty where everybody agrees on all of the words, but a treaty all the same. Fethi's already talked about some of the history at Deakin, and certainly Professor Mark Rose starting with us next year is a milestone for us, and we really look forward to welcoming Mark in January. This year's NIDOC theme was Voice Treaty Truth, let's work together for a shared future, and I think that sentiment is vitally important. Pat Thompson, who was the co-chair, said we need our fellow Australians to join us on this journey, to finish the unfinished business of this country. For Deakin, that's not a theoretical academic construct. We have to be part of that journey. We have to make sure that as a university, we play our part in the vital functions of universities. One of those is to be critical and conscious. It's to provide a forum, a space, a set of environments where ideas that are not university popular, ideas that are challenging, ideas that will shake people's views on the world will be aired, and will be aired with justice, and will be aired with fairness. And I think as we play our part in both the treaty in Victoria and the wider conversations across the nation, it is important that we as a university are there making sure that we have a part to play. And it's in that context that I'm delighted to introduce Professor Marcia Langton. Marcia holds the Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne and was appointed Distinguished Redmond Barry Chair. She is an anthropologist and a geographer, is widely published on topics in Australian Indigenous Studies, including Aboriginal land tenure, Aboriginal art, and Indigenous agreement making. Professor Langton was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in 1993 for services to anthropology and advocacy of Aboriginal rights. She is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. In 2017, Professor Langton was appointed as the first Associate Provost at the University of Melbourne. Her research interests lie in the areas of political and legal anthropology, Indigenous agreements and engagement with the minerals industry, and Indigenous culture and art. She's established and managed several collaborative research projects funded by the ARC, industry partners, and a sequence of ARC Linkage grants in the fields of Indigenous agreement making and implementation, overcoming poverty and marginalisation by establishing good practice in governance and distribution of mining benefits, and traditional resource rights. Professor Langton has a track record in traditional Indigenous knowledge systems, digital technologies, and developed critical methodologies for researchers, including scientists, social scientists, and historians, particularly with a focus in the challenges of sustaining cultural knowledge and biological diversity in Aboriginal societies. And as you also heard from Bethy, she now has a critically important national role in determining the voice. I cannot think of anyone better qualified or more suitable to deliver the 2019 UNESCO Oration, and I am pleased to invite Professor Marcia Langton to the podium. Marcia, thank you.
Thank you, Professors Mansouri and Martin. It's a very great honour to follow the other UNESCO orators to give this oration. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri traditional owners and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Now, not to embarrass you in any way, but just to remind you of the pall of history. These are the words of Alfred Deakin in 1901, and I'm sure you're quite familiar with them, but let me remind you of what he said. In another century, the probability is that Australia will be a white continent with not a black or even dark skin amongst its inhabitants. The Aboriginal race has died out in the south and is dying fast in the north and west, even where most gently treated. Other races are to be excluded by legislation if they are tinted to any degree. The yellow, the brown and the copper coloured are to be forbidden to land anywhere. You don't have to change the name. We might do something about answering back. The rights of Indigenous peoples globally have been elucidated in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This is not a convention or binding law. It is a set of standards. It has been ratified by many UN member states, and while its principles could be reflected in domestic law, this has rarely been the case. Australian domestic laws that purport to protect Indigenous rights arose largely not from the Declaration, but from the determination of Indigenous people to right the wrongs done to us since the beginning of colonisation in the 18th century. Article 3 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states, Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. This guarantees the right to freely determine their political condition and the right to freely pursue their form of economic, social and cultural development. A robust domestic expression of this right in Australia is a matter of justice. As a long-time supporter of human rights and after almost half a century as a participant, witness and victim of government policies that affect Aboriginal people, I remain vigilant about the sense of agency that Indigenous people must bring to the way in which we are encapsulated as minorities in this nation state. I am forced to ask these questions in 2019. When would I be able to describe a sense of justice for Indigenous Australians in their long struggle to overcome the ravages of colonisation? When could we, as Australians all, say that justice has been served? What would need to be done to enable the colonised to acknowledge that justice has been done? What if the road ahead is very long and we are faced with the task of constant vigilance? The post-World War II human rights framework has become vulnerable to its own weaknesses and to attacks from those who do not share a sense of humanitarian ideals. The idea of the dignity of the individual, the dignity of life, has lost favour in an age of cynicism, a new appetite for pointless wars and violence, the ubiquity of social media and the anonymity of those who use it to propagate hate and fear, the rise of the new right and white supremacism, and a growing contempt for the previously colonised and invaded peoples who might have believed until recently that a turning point had been reached with those who benefited from imperialism. We might have believed that those who benefited from imperialism had come to terms with the harm caused to us and to all those peoples whose life worlds were overrun by aliens with little or no regard for their lives and dignity. Colonisation and the frontier wars took a terrible toll on the first peoples of Australia. Only in the last 50 years have we been able to imagine a better way of being Aboriginal in our own country. Not despised as vermin, not downtrodden and marginalised, not victims of sympathy and charity, but agents in shaping our own futures as persons with dignity and all the opportunities that other Australians have. A new idea about how we, as Indigenous people, as the first peoples in Australia, could live with dignity in the Australian nation has emerged. The idea of constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians took many years to take form. One of the markers of the determination for recognition is the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart. By itself, the inclusion in our Constitution of a provision for an Indigenous voice will not overcome the ravages of colonisation and more than a century of exclusion from Australian life. It is not only we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who recognise the absence of any reckoning with us in the imagining of the nation. Other Australians recognise that we are not just absent, but entirely residual in the Constitution, or, I mean to say, made even more absent by the removal of two racist provisions in 1967. The celebration of the purported beginnings of the nation ignores 65,000 years of our history. In his essay, Moment of Truth, historian Professor Mark McKenna observes that you can walk across the vast open spaces of Canberra's parliamentary triangle and there is more than enough room to reflect on Australia's future. Nature has been ironed out, it's all grass and sky. Standing in the strip between the Tent Embassy and Lake Burley Griffin, the invented nature of the place hits you in the face, and the silence. It is not only the absence of any acknowledgement of the country's violent foundation that makes the silence palpable, but also 65,000 years of Indigenous occupation. If it were not for the Tent Embassy and the easily missed Reconciliation Place, Indigenous Australia would have no obvious presence within the parliamentary triangle. More than a century after Federation, Australians still struggle to include Indigenous people in our vision of the nation. Further, like us, like other Australians I have spoken to, Mark McKenna expressed a note of impatience with the nation's slow progress towards truth-telling and settlement of the historical burden of colonisation. He wrote, "The time for pitting white against black, shame against pride, and one people's history against another's has had its day. After nearly 50 years of deeply divisive debates over the country's foundation and its legacy for Indigenous Australians, Australia stands at a crossroads. We either make the Commonwealth stronger and more complete through an honest reckoning with the past, or we unmake the nation by clinging to triumphant narratives in which the violence inherent in the nation's foundation is trivialised." I have written elsewhere about the proposals advanced by Indigenous Australians, such as the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which calls for voice treaty truth. The grounds for this proposal, like many others, are the historical injustices that plague our politics, governance and relationships. For example, unlike other former British colonies, there is no treaty with its Indigenous people, although there may be two obscure exceptions to that generally understood notion of history. Customary systems of law predate the arrival of the British by many thousands of years and survive, often in highly adapted forms, in many parts of post-colonial Australia. Native title recognition is just over a quarter of a century old. This is in contrast to other common law jurisdictions such as New Zealand and Canada, where native title has been recognised for at least 150 years. If there were a constitutionally enshrined First Nations voice, a commission authorised by a constitutional power to advise Parliament, just as the Productivity Commission, the Australia Council and many other bodies do, the absurd policies that have ruined lives for generations would not exist. Every Indigenous person says the same things in slightly different ways. Every statement from the Yirrkala petitions to the Uluru Statement from the Heart say the same things in slightly different ways. How can all of this be ignored? My own experience of speaking to thousands of non-Indigenous Australians has led me to conclude that they want an end to this charade too, just as McKenna wrote. They want to live in a nation in which we are treated with respect. They want a release from the terrible guilt that they cannot ignore once they understand what happened in our history. They want us to have dignity, and they will approve of the Uluru Statement from the Heart referendum question. However, several Prime Ministers, one after another, have rejected the proposals put to them about how we as Indigenous Australians could be recognised in the Constitution of Australia, or they have kicked the problem down the road by setting up inquiries. By the way, I was in fact appointed by Julia Gillard to the expert panel on the recognition of Indigenous Australians. That was many years ago. I've just been appointed to yet another group, one not concerned with constitutional recognition, however, but how 800,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can have a say in government decisions that affect them. This is a different problem, and in some ways more difficult. The urgency of the terrible disparity in living conditions, health, education, employment, housing, and in so many other areas cannot wait for constitutional recognition. Governments are too slow to respond to the very sound recommendations made to them repeatedly and in good faith. Too many Indigenous lives have been cut short by the impact of failed government policies, and there are few who would disagree that it is time to bring a halt to this dreadful state of affairs. Minister Ken Wyatt, the first Indigenous Minister for Indigenous Australians in the Parliament of the Commonwealth, recognised this in establishing the Indigenous co-design process for an Indigenous voice. he has appointed me and Professor Tom Calmer, AO, to co-chair the Senior Advisory Group. We will join the chairs of 2 more groups whose members will be appointed soon, the National Co-Design Group and the Local and Regional Decision-Making Design Group, in advising the Minister of our recommendations. Our communique issued at the end of our meeting today explains that the group comprises 19 members drawn from a broad cross-section of the Australian community. Members have a range of backgrounds and bring different experiences and expertise to the table. The Minister provided an open statement to the group and media, noting the historic opportunity presented by the process. He asked that the focus remains on mechanisms and models to ensure all 800,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the country can have a say in decisions that affect them. The group agreed clear communication is critical so Australians have the opportunity to engage with and understand the co-design process. The group also recognises that all the work to date, historically, requires us to ensure that we learn from current and past models. We committed to ensuring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from across the nation would finally have direct input to government about their experiences, ideas and aspirations. This is a concept we invite all Australians to embrace. Ken Wyatt has to balance the wishes and views of a broad range of Australians with the political realities of delivering achievable change. And just to reiterate an answer to the question earlier about some of the members of our advisory group, I just want to remind you that only 8 of the 44 referendums held in Australian history succeeded, and that historically referendums that had a formal no case failed, all of them failed, that the greater majority of Australians, over 60%, have to vote for in favour of a referendum question, and a majority of state and territory parliaments have to vote in favour of a referendum question in order for a referendum to succeed. The Uluru Statement from the Heart is highly significant as we consider the problem of involving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in government-supported efforts to deal with the crisis in our homes and communities and close the gap on our disadvantages. Without meaningful constitutional recognition, Australia remains trapped in Deakin's idea of Australia for the white man. This idea is deeply ingrained in Australian life, and we see it played out in most encounters between government officials and Indigenous people. It underlies the life-threatening disadvantages we face. It is my hope that this process, established by Minister Ken Wyatt, will bring together the innovative and effective institutions and approaches that have been established in Indigenous affairs since the abolition of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission in 2005. ATSIC was abolished in a storm of racialist political commentary, which pinned the poor performance of a few people onto the entire Indigenous population and our right to be represented in the body politic. The Howard government left no formal model for Indigenous engagement with government. All government engagement with Indigenous Australia and its policies were mainstreamed, and that involved eradicating any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander involvement in our own affairs, and very deliberately trying to assimilate Indigenous people to a fantasy about modern Australia, and I would add the fantasy of Deakin's Australia for the white man vision. That process demoralised Indigenous people throughout the country and threw Indigenous government relations, policies and services into disarray. The disaster that ensued led to the policy of closing the gap to deal with the worsening outcomes as a result, and that too has failed. The worst failure was the redesign of the conventional funding arrangements into the Indigenous Advancement Strategy in 2014. It diverted funding away from a quarter of our frontline organisations to non-Indigenous, non-government organisations with little or no capacity to engage or deliver to Indigenous Australia, and the outcomes have been slammed by everyone paying attention. Our population is approaching 1 million, and with the geographic spread and distance of many in our communities from the main centres of administration and services, without a much more targeted approach to ensuring Indigenous well-being, the outcome can only be a continuing disaster. The lack of a formal means of having a say in our affairs has caused many policy failures, and the slow progress in closing the gaps in the levels of disadvantage in the Indigenous population can be largely attributed to the refusal of federal governments during the last 14 years to this lack of representation of Indigenous people in shaping policies that affect our lives, in all the social determinants of our well-being, and the survival of our cultures and languages, to list just a few. None of the 7 targets of the Closing the Gap strategy will be met in the timeframes proposed. Ministers for Indigenous Affairs have come and gone, and while small steps have been made to better Indigenous lives, the failures are too many to mention. Every Australian, whether Indigenous or not, has a right to feel outrage about this state of affairs. Since then, the issue of constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians has been investigated and talked about in the hope that a secure and sustainable platform for including people in the nation's affairs can be established. The purpose of the process that Ken Wyatt has announced is to develop models to enhance local and regional decision making and provide a voice for Indigenous Australians to government. Our role on the advisory group is to advise the Minister and to listen to Indigenous Australians about their aspirations for options for a model that ensure that they're heard at the local, state and federal levels. We will also receive submissions from governments, non-government entities and the public. The next 12 months will consist of 2 stages to develop and refine models. In the first stage, 2 groups will be formed, the local and regional co-design group and the national co-design group, to develop models to improve this state of affairs. In stage 2, the members of these groups will engage with Indigenous leaders, communities and stakeholders across the country and test models. My view is that we are already dealing with an incoherent ecosystem of Indigenous representative mechanisms across the country, most of them informal, some recognised in statutes in some jurisdictions, and of course there are 2 jurisdictions that recognise Indigenous people constitutionally. There are more than 3,500 Indigenous corporations under the Corporations Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Act, many of which provide the governance and services to our people that the 3 tiers of government refuse to provide or are incapable of providing. The many people who work in these corporations, many voluntarily, struggle to get a government official on the phone. There is constant and ultimately ineffective competition among all the agencies, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, for ever shrinking government funds for essential services. While the Uluru Statement shows a way forward, the details of how this could be achieved have not been enunciated. If the benefits of Australia's prosperity are to be fairly shared with all Indigenous citizens, a new paradigm of Indigenous development, particularly economic development, is needed, with a readiness to embrace bold initiatives and translate it into action. This imperative is most critical for those in remote parts of Australia where the poorest Australians live. Compared to the rest of the nation, their education, employment and business development are all stuck around the bottom of the pack. Indeed, the parallels are closer to those groups in developing countries which have been excluded from the global economic improvements of the past few decades. Indigenous people want to take responsibility for changing this situation, for changing it dramatically and intergenerationally. This requires a new policy and funding paradigm across the Federation. It requires governments changing their focus to the mix of incentives and disincentives affecting the scope and pace of economic development to enable Indigenous-led development and towards much more productivity and government expenditure on services for Indigenous Australians. There has been extensive thinking and policy development undertaken by Indigenous people and their leaders and organisations in recent years. Two key developments that are most innovative and promise a way forward include the COAD partnership with the Coalition of Peak Indigenous Bodies and the Empowered Communities Group based on the Empowered Communities Design Report. Along with the Close the Gap initiative, these go some way towards overcoming the key obstacle, the inability of governments to find a way to systematically and comprehensively engage with Indigenous Australians on policy design and implementation. These initiatives point governments and other stakeholders toward the further reforms so urgently required. The Coalition of Peaks is a representative body comprised of around 40 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organisations that have come together to have their collective voice heard on issues that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Since the Closing the Gap framework and targets were first implemented in 2008, they have been calling on government to recognise the expertise that exists in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations. In an historical agreement, the Coalition of Peaks has formed a joint partnership with the Council of Australian Governments in order to collaborate on the Closing the Gap refresh process. This is the first time that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices have not only been invited to the table, but have also been empowered with shared decision-making responsibilities. So for this very formal partnership of our peak bodies to work with the Council of Australian Governments is really a first in Australian political history. The full partnership agreement is on the website of the National Aboriginal Community Control Health Organisation website. The partnership agreement was signed by the Prime Minister. The Coalition of Peaks are beginning to work with the joint partnership to effect meaningful change. And so already Minister Wyatt and the convener of the peak bodies, Pat Turner, are chairing meetings which involves the government officials from the 3 levels of government. So that's an innovation that we need to take into account as we consider changing the way that Indigenous people are treated by Australian governments. Another of the most important Indigenous initiatives is called Empowered Communities. The leaders of 8 Australian regions across the country met some years ago to develop a new approach developed on their combined experience of attempting year after year to bring about community development and economic inclusion among their peoples. The leaders worked with a team of experts, almost all of whom were voluntary, and many came from leading corporations such as banks, advisory firms, law firms and so on. They delivered a comprehensive report and a design to former Prime Minister, the Honourable Tony Abbott and his government. They aimed to deliver a cost-effective approach to delivering outcomes in a timely manner. So their vision was this, is this: Indigenous peoples empowering themselves and governments sharing and in some cases relinquishing certain powers and responsibilities and supporting Indigenous people. It is premised on a two-pronged development goal: to close the gap on the social and economic disadvantage and to preserve Indigenous cultural and linguistic heritage for future generations. I think their great contribution lies in the set of social norms that they developed aimed at leading individuals and families to prosperity and developing vibrant and strong communities. Their second aim was to, in that regard, was to ensure that government-funded programs and services are prioritised to support Indigenous people toward this aim. In other words, in each of these regions, they would have a negotiating group that would say to government, no, we don't want money for that. No, we don't want you to bring that program into our community because we don't want it. We want this. And this is what you will fund. So their proposal was mostly accepted. You can see that government is equivocating about the scary bits, but we see a lot of that. So in one of their early statements they say this: restoring social norms is fundamental to empowered communities. A strong commitment to these norms is required to be an empowered and communities region recognised by the group and part of the system. Regional agreements and funding contracts will be prioritised around services needed to establish or restore the following norms. Children attend school every day, are on time and are school ready. Capable adults participate in either training or work. Children and those who are vulnerable are cared for and safe. People must abide by the conditions related to their tenancy in public housing. People do not commit domestic violence, alcohol and drug offences or petty crimes. So you won't see that in government policy, except maybe for school attendance, but 30 officers operating in North Australia to overcome the problem of failure to attend school is not going to solve the problem. This has to be a social norm adopted into the functioning of our frontline service organisations. And their reform policy principles involve a policy of responsibility, which has two parts. Public policy should not restrict Indigenous responsibility, and there is an obligation to act to enable Indigenous individuals and families to achieve responsibility. In other words, to overcome, the standard government view of Indigenous people as passive recipients of government largesse and government policy manoeuvres. And they say further, we do not say that governments should go away. They have an important role to play, particularly the Australian government, provided they have their act together and are guided by a proven theory of action. Fundamentally, that role must be that of enabler, to set the conditions for success by removing barriers and perverse incentives that support the current welfare paradigm while opening pathways and using positive incentives to accelerate desired development. Governments can't create or lead lives for people. It is a fatal conceit when they try. It is all too often overlooked that government action through various welfare and other services can have the unintended consequence of reducing Indigenous human capital rather than enhancing it. So I think that that approach is absolutely essential as we go forward in developing an approach to the voice or voices of Indigenous people to Australian governments. It is my own strongly held view, based on a great deal of evidence, that Indigenous people must pull the levers of the policy machine that fails us over and over again, resulting in huge waste with a death toll to match. Indigenous people who are able to participate in these roles feel a great accountability to those who are not thriving in our communities. The bureaucratic machine left to its own devices is a failed model. It's time for Australians to face that truth and empower us to fix the system. In the face of accelerating suicide and incarceration rates, and in the last 2 weeks, 2 Indigenous people have been killed in custody. So these deaths are becoming far too regular, and institutions are becoming far too blasé about it. The infectious disease epidemics taking lives across our communities, and the despair amongst the poorest and least powerful Australians requires us to rethink the paradigm. It makes no sense, it costs too much money, and it causes more damage. We've reached the stage at which Indigenous Australians simply no longer trust governments and expect Indigenous leadership in these affairs. Indigenous people must therefore carry the responsibility for driving this. We must build human capital, assets, businesses and wealth, and do what's needed to transition out of poverty, build on a strong educational foundation. This means being prepared to take risks and learning the lessons of the past, including the mistake of an over-dependence on government to solve problems, and less than fully productive investments of Indigenous time and money. But it also means new attitudes and new ways of operating on the part of governments, the business sector and the community more generally. The needed transformation will take time to collect the necessary data, to inform and involve those affected, and to embed new thinking and practice, including learning from those both here and overseas. And I just want to emphasise that Indigenous Australians living in remote areas are a forgotten people when it comes to inclusion in the country's prosperity. They are the poorest of the poor in Australia. And now they face the prospect of coping with even less because of the demands of fiscal consolidation and restraint by governments at all levels. We desperately need a better way. A history of economic exclusion of Indigenous people throughout Australian history, from the frontier encounters to the work for the dole measures that persist, have left us with difficult challenges. If we hope to achieve Indigenous parity, we need effective policies and government and private sector commitment. Universities have a role to play, of course, a critical role. Employment and training strategies are also important. However, there will be little progress in achieving Indigenous parity if we do not address the weaknesses in the approaches adopted by successive governments. Throughout the world, there is broad consensus that the only sustainable exit from poverty is economic progress, with development that is inclusive of the most disadvantaged. Here in Australia, despite decades of unprecedented growth nationally, entrenched poverty remains a reality for a significant proportion of our population. It may surprise you, however, that half the Indigenous population, or about half, is likely to achieve levels of parity in their socio-economic conditions in their lifetime, while the other half of our population are more than likely to remain in desperately poor conditions, which give rise to the high levels of morbidity, low rates of life expectancy, education, employment and housing. In 2015, Deloitte Access Economics provided a credible answer to the national what-if question. Where would Australia stand economically if Indigenous Australians over the next generation were to achieve the same life expectancy, education and employment outcomes as other Australians? In essence, this is the business case for introducing a new development paradigm. This scenario provides an indication of the very significant benefits that could flow from achieving economic development for all Indigenous people rather than just half as now. And these gains would not be secured solely by Indigenous people. They would be shared widely with the population as a whole. The key message is that so long as gaps remain, heavy economic and social costs must be borne, while huge potential benefits go begging. So Deloitte's key findings were that our economy as a whole would be richer by 24 billion per year, or 1.15% of GDP, if we reached parity. There would be a much larger tax base, lifting revenues by over 7 billion. Higher wealth among Indigenous people would translate into a dramatic reduction in spending, mostly on welfare, of almost 5 billion. Closing education and health gaps would boost jobs for Indigenous people by almost 40,000, and the gains for those in remote Australia would be disproportionately large. Some 6.5 billion, or more than a quarter of the projected gains in GDP from closing the gap, would be realised for the Indigenous people living there. Restoring social norms is fundamental, and a strong commitment to these norms is necessary. So, to conclude, I want to say this. Along with a measure of self-determination that should emerge from the co-design of an Indigenous voice or voices to government, we are entitled to take responsibility, to exercise our agency in determining our futures, to be our own agents. Thank you.
Marcia Langton for that speech. I think it raises a number of really important issues in relation to where we are in this space. I know you agreed to field some questions. I'm happy to see perhaps a show of hands. We can field maybe 3 questions/comments and see how we go with time. So if you have really some burning questions and you want to address to Professor Langton, we're happy to, or comments perhaps. You can see that, John. Very nice to have you here, Barry. Sorry, did I see? Yes.
Oh, Marcia, thank you. Thank you. Look, I just wrote down a little comment you made, or a statement you made, which was that Indigenous Australians no longer trust governments, which I rather enjoyed. And I wondered when Indigenous Australians did trust governments.
There were moments in the 1970s, 80s and 90s when governments made an enormous effort to right the wrongs of the past. So the 1976 Aboriginal Land Rights Act in the Northern Territory, but prior to that, of course, the Whitlam government's inquiry into land rights, which resulted in that act, but more particularly the Whitlam government's negotiations with the Queensland government, where I grew up, and Whitlam, who was a constitutional lawyer before he became a politician and was well aware of Australia's human rights duties, ended the apartheid system in Queensland. And he did it by stealth. Do you know the formal racial discrimination in Queensland did not end until 1984. So that was a great moment for Indigenous people in Queensland. That is when most of us ceased to be wards of the state. And then, you know, there was the Mabo number 2 decision in the High Court and a series of negotiations with the Keating government, which resulted in the Native Title Act. And before it was amended to statutorily define native title holders and was reduced in its effectiveness by the powers given to state and territory governments in relation to the implementation of the Act, it was a reasonable compromise that gave us hope. So while native title is in many ways a great injustice, or native title recognition is a great injustice because it's effectively an extinguishment doctrine, and the Act itself is the legislation that enables legal extinguishment of native title. It nevertheless provided for those groups who are still able to prove an unbroken link to pre-colonial times through descent by reference to historical documents. And so very important native title determinations have resulted, and many Indigenous groups have benefited from the right to negotiate provision, which we were able to get into the Act after John Howard's bucket loads of extinguishment amendments. And you can see most of those agreements that were negotiated, native title agreements, on the Agreements, Treaties and Negotiated Settlements website. There must be about 1,000 native title agreements now, and they do deliver, in probably at least a third of the cases, very significant benefits to the communities involved, or the native title holding groups involved. The Native Title Act has resulted in the establishment of over 150 prescribed bodies corporate. That is formal trusts that hold native title and are managed by the native title holders, in addition to the Aboriginal trusts under statutes. So I know that there is an enormous cynicism, especially here in the south, about whether or not Indigenous people will ever become or will ever enjoy a dignified role in the nation. I want to dissuade you of that cynicism. These rights have been too hard won for us to be pushed back now by an avalanche of cynicism, and I perfectly understand the ordinary Australian's contempt for governments. We feel it more than you do, but you know, in our case, lives truly depend on us getting this right. So I don't want to be dissuaded by cynicism about what we're trying to achieve. We went into the native title negotiations with the Keating government in 1992, and we were pilloried not only by the cynical left, but also by many in our own communities who accused us of attempting to sell out to the government. You know, the alternative was no native title at all. The states and territories, the Cattlemen's Association, the National Farmers Federation, the Australian Mining Industry Council and many other groups had been meeting with the Keating government long before we landed in the corridors of the Canberra Parliament, and they had negotiated away our native title rights that were recognised by the High Court. You might as well say that in 1992 we won and lost native title. We had to turn back the tide of race hate coming from those industry groups and from the state and territory governments, and we did it. We did it. Most people are not aware of what we achieved in 1992, 93, leading into 94. People now, many years later, take the Native Title Act for granted. There would be no native title unless Keating in the House of Reps, speaking for his cabinet, and Gareth Evans in the Senate, hadn't agreed to our propositions. And the proposition we put to them, the fundamental proposition was this: if you abolish native title by fiat, you are committing the greatest act of racial discrimination in Australian history. You cannot discriminate on the grounds of race against our rights to native title and get away with it. We will not let you get away with that. And, you know, I'll just remind you of what some people thought about the idea of race back then, and I am talking about Labor members of Parliament. I said to one of them, what you're proposing is in breach of the Racial Discrimination Act. And he said, the Racial Discrimination Act? But that only applies to Aborigines. And I said, no, it applies to everybody. He said, I'm not a race. I'm not. I said, you are actually. And then, you know, later on, when we were defending the Racial Discrimination Act, when basically all the non-white peoples in Australia came together to stop the abolition of 18C or the weakening of 18C, the backbench, including the Labor Party, said, oh no, you know, we have to be very careful about this because of the Muslims, you know. And we said, well, they're not a race. I said, yes, they are. So, you know, we've gone into bat for a very long time, for decades, on really fundamental issues that affect your sense of citizenship. And we would greatly appreciate your support rather than your cynicism about whether or not we succeed. These are hard times.
Speaking of the Keating government, we have a question from a former member of that government, the Honourable Barry Jones, who's with us tonight, and he wants to say a few words.
I just want to make a comment and then ask for Marcia's reaction. And congratulations on the speech, and I admire your courage, vision and essentially optimism. I mean, it's the only way to go. But I'm very conscious that there was a period, say roughly between 1966, when Harold Holt came in, and 1996, when racism was off the political agenda. Now it's back. It began just with dog whistling in 96, but then continued. And I've been doing a bit of pretty hard research on this, and my calculation is that at the moment, I would say that in Australia, judging from the last federal election, you've got a hard right vote in Australia about 9.1%. The point is that governments say, well, that 9.1% is not enough to elect members of Parliament on their own, but their preferences will determine who gets in or not. So the result is that, just as you find in the United States, the major parties say, well, we can't offend our base. Our base is the critical thing. You can't offend them. So the difficulty is that when governments and oppositions too are thinking very short term, you can be absolutely certain that the first item on the agenda after the Morrison government was re-elected unexpectedly, the first item on the agenda would be, how do we win in 2022? And so they're not thinking about a 10-year program, they're thinking about how they get back next time. So the result is that there's tremendous goodwill among people in so much of the Commonwealth. How do we mobilise effectively so that we can support the kind of vision that you have?
Well, you know, I don't quite agree with your opening statement. of course, I have to remind you that the Racial Discrimination Act received consent.
Yep.
On the 31st of October, or became effective on the 31st of October 1975. And that act really was the safety net for so much that we've been able to achieve. People mainly pay attention to 18C as if all we're concerned about is whether or not some idiot calls us a stupid racist name. When you get to my age, you know, the constant microaggressions are water off a duck's back. The really important issues were issues like those that John Koowarta faced. Now, nobody in this room will remember who John Koowarta was, but he went to what was then called the Aboriginal Land Commission to get help to buy a station in Cape York where his people could live on their traditional country. And his name, Koowarta, means, you know, descendant or relative of the dingo ancestor. And he was a very traditional man. The Queensland government, the cabinet, had a decision, made a policy that no Aboriginal people could own land. And so they would not transfer title to the Aboriginal Land Commission. So Koowarta took the matter all the way to the High Court using the Racial Discrimination Act, and he won. It was a very important decision by the High Court in Koowarta, but in the meantime, what the Queensland government had done was hand all the land over to a national park. So their traditional country became almost entirely a national park with, you know, an occasional visiting white ranger. And so, you know, that sense of injustice built up, because that wasn't the first case like that in Queensland. There was an earlier case that went to the Privy Council, Pinekinner. Privy Council ruled against Pinekinner. And then, of course, you had Mabo number 1, then Mabo number 2, and then Wick 1 and Wick 2. So all of those cases, note, were in Queensland, which was, until 1984, formally racist. They had a formal racist system. And so the resentment had built up to the point where people just kept litigating and litigating, and many of the great wins that we've had to establish our Indigenous rights, our civil rights, have been as a result of the Racial Discrimination Act. Now, most of these cases have passed by public attention. I mean, you don't seem to be aware of them. There were, last count when I left the Northern Territory 20 years ago, 28 cases to the High Court involving the Aboriginal Land Rights Act. So we're highly litigious people. And this is because we face an existential crisis. And this is why we use a range of strategies. So it's not true that race was off the agenda. Race was very much on the agenda in all of those cases. Race was on the agenda in Mabo number 2. So, yes, you're right about the electorate and how parties respond to that far-right section of the community. But, you know, down here it might be 9.1%, but let me tell you, in Queensland it's 40%.
Well, it's less than Victoria, but it is very, very large in Queensland.
It's 40% in Queensland.
Yeah.
And, you know, of course, the problem is that many of them don't even realise that they're far-right, trending towards proto-fascist. Some of them are openly fascist, like, what's his name? Fraser Anning. He's openly, you know, a self-avowed fascist. And there's, you know, quite a few of them. But, you know, we faced a situation far, far worse back in the 70s, 80s and 90s when we got our first wins. You might remember the hysterical debate across the nation when the High Court handed down its decision in Mabo No. 2.
Yep.
Even Tim Fisher, and apparently the late Tim Fisher, an apparently reasonable man, called the High Court judges pissants.
True. He did change.
Too late. So, you know, these were matters of race. The Australian Mining Industry Council campaigned against us, spending millions of dollars on ridiculous television advertisements to convince you that we were going to take everything from you. And they kept doing that for years. So race was not off the agenda. It's just that they're so damn good at racism, you didn't even notice.
I think it's time to invite our Vice Chancellor to offer a few words and offer you the gifts.
On behalf of everyone, Professor Langton, that was thoughtful, provocative, challenging, and actually I think a really inspiring balance between a sense of optimism but also a sense of real challenge for all of us in what the next steps are. So on behalf of everybody at Deakin, maybe I shouldn't say that. Everyone at the university and everyone here this evening, can we thank you hugely. It was a masterful oration and one that many of us will remember for a very long time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Marcia Langton, for delivering the 2019 oration. Thank you all for being here. We look forward to seeing you in 2020. And this oration is now concluded. Thank you.